Hi, I'm Leonard Leff with some thoughts about The Lady Vanishes and Alfred Hitchcock, the world's most famous movie extra. Here he is, smoking a cigarette and shrugging his shoulders, perhaps in time to a tune he's humming. But what's that he's carrying? A lunchbox? A lens case? Maybe packets of his special tea, the favorite of Miss Froy and a million Mexicans. Whatever it was, it cleared customs, and so did The Lady Vanishes, produced in 1938 and a hit in New York as well as London. By then, both Hitchcock and his pictures were fairly well known. The Times of London called him the Prince of English thrill makers. A New York Times reporter went further. Hitchcock was, quote, the greatest director of screen melodramas in the world. Was this praise or faint praise? The press, after all, called him a thrill maker, not an artist. Even his own industry shared that perception. The captains of British cinema poured money into prestige films, like The Private Life of Henry VIII with Charles Laughton. But they could treat Hitchcock satisfactorily on one picture, like Young and Innocent in 1937, then starve him on others. In 1934, in what seems astonishing today, the distributor of The Man Who Knew Too Much sold the movie to theaters as the second half of a double bill. 4 years later, after many favorable reviews of his work, Hitchcock had to direct The Lady Vanishes on, he said, one of the smaller Islington stages, on a set 90 feet long. We used one rail coach. All the rest were transparencies or miniatures. As Hitchcock well knew, the British film industry existed in the shadow of Hollywood. American movies dominated local theaters. Parliament intervened, but the so-called quota quickies that resulted were mediocre imitations of American B pictures. They were also disappointments at the box office. Imported talent fared no better. Many stars and directors did their best work elsewhere. For this and other reasons, the British moguls counted on genre pictures to rationalize production. As their contribution in the 1930s, Hitchcock and his collaborators produced the so-called thriller sextet: The Man Who Knew Too Much, The 39 Steps, Secret Agent, Sabotage, Young and Innocent, and The Lady Vanishes were movies whose stories and characters generally conformed to the rules of the spy picture, a subgenre of the crime picture. As historians Charles Barr and Tom Ryle have shown, the roots of the spy picture were in popular fiction. Its stories were fantastic, but its themes were sometimes somber. The thriller author John Buchan once had a character say, quote, civilization anywhere is a very thin crust. Hitchcock could not have said it better. Buchan influenced Hitchcock, whose 39 Steps was adapted from the Buchan novel published in 1915. Buchan said his goal was to tell a story where the incidents defy the probabilities and march just inside the borders of the possible. Hitchcock, along with his writers, do just that in The Lady Vanishes and other pictures in the sextet. But despite their success, Hitchcock protested that working in a genre-dominated studio system held him back. As he told a reporter in 1938, "Again and again I have been prevented from putting on the screen authentic accounts of incidents in British life." Perhaps he protested too much. Several pictures in the sextet were topical, and all were as notable for their departures from genre conventions as their observance of them. Moreover, thanks in part to his associates, the sextet was celebrated for its humor as well as its imaginative photography and cutting. Now, these pictures did not change the landscape of the British film industry or even the filmmaking methods of Hitchcock's peers. In retrospect, however, we see them not as mere romantic thrillers or melodramas, but as a new genre, something we call the Hitchcock picture. Its ingredients were at once familiar and fresh. They included a man, a woman, an urbane villain, things like staircases, handcuffs, keys, dizzying heights, and, or so we assume, spiked brandies. Eyeglasses belong on that list, and so do birds, which in one movie could appear on the periphery of the frame, or in passing, and in another movie assume center stage. When we search for evidence of the Hitchcock touch, we seem to find it everywhere, in large spaces and small. In The Lady Vanishes, for instance, we ask ourselves, who else but the Jesuit-educated Hitchcock would have dressed a nun in heels and had the first audible words from her mouth invoke the devil?
How the devil do I know how they cottoned on? Somebody must have tipped him off.
Who else would have had her freshen her makeup while still dressed in her habit? But the director was not a one-man show, not then and not later. On The Lady Vanishes, as well as others, he had very smart writers. The word writers, by the way, was my word. Hitchcock occasionally called them constructionists, making them sound more like carpenters than architects. But consider the origins and writers of The Lady Vanishes. First came the 1936 novel The Wheel Spins by Ethel Lena White. Next came the screen adaptation by Frank Launder and Sidney Gilliat. The screenwriters adopted the broad outline of the novel and used many of its characters, from Miss Froy and Madame Coomer, the fake Miss Froy, to the wicked doctor, his accomplice the nun, though not in high heels, Eric Todhunter and his lover, Margaret, and Iris herself, who fears she's losing her sanity, though more so in the novel than the movie. The screenwriters also borrowed the romance that Iris has with a fellow passenger, an engineer in the novel, a musicologist in the film, and in both the only one on the train who supports her. But Launder and Gilliat were not slaves to Ethel Lena White. They eliminated two unmarried sisters, a vicar, and the vicar's wife, all of them stereotypes in the novel. They created the bachelor couple, Caldecott and Charters, and they changed the nature of Miss Froy. In the novel, she was caught up by chance in political skullduggery. In the script, she was a professional spy. Finally, they strengthened the leading male in the novel and had Iris ditch a fiancé for him. Launder and Gilliat finished the screenplay before Hitchcock agreed to direct it. But Hitchcock made changes too. He invented Signor Dappo. He also asked the writers to alter the beginning of the story and extend the ending. He no doubt added small but telling details throughout, as did Alma Reville, Mrs. Alfred Hitchcock, and the woman credited with continuity on The Lady Vanishes. What exactly did she do? She may only have served as her husband's sounding board. If so, that was enough. As Hitchcock said many times, she's the only critic I fear. So while The Lady Vanishes may seem to be quintessential Alfred Hitchcock, its shooting script bore the fingerprints of White, Launder, Gilliat, and Reville, as well as the director himself. In the margins of his shooting scripts, Hitchcock sketched each shot. On The Lady Vanishes, the task of turning those drawings into images belonged to Jack Cox, who had shot 10 of Hitchcock's previous pictures. Hitchcock later said that he had trained Cox, but the truth was otherwise. Cox was a respected veteran of the British silent cinema, and one of its best effects photographers. He was adept at overlays, dissolves, diffused images, and double exposures. He also shot the models in The Lady Vanishes, and if he and Hitchcock had wanted the snowed-in Bandrican village to resemble a department store window at Christmas, they succeeded. What mattered, of course, was Cox's work inside the train, where he and the sound effects recorder had to establish the illusion of rail travel. Like his rear projection work, Cox made most of his contributions almost invisible. No intense treatment of light and shade, no diffusion for glamour, except for some reason on Margaret, and no oblique or otherwise bizarre angles. This somewhat conservative approach was more characteristic of The Lady Vanishes than other pictures in the sextet, so it may have been driven less by aesthetics than budgets. Nonetheless, Cox and Hitchcock produced some potent effects. Hitchcock told the press that he built excitement, quote, not by quick cutting or by incessant camera movement, but by packing every sequence with incident and small details of characterization. In fact, many scenes in The Lady Vanishes unfold in real time. In this shot, the narrative slows down and the cutting stops, while Gilbert not only entertains and charms Iris, but recaps the plot for latecomers. The last scene of the picture opens with Gilbert giving Iris a right to the chin and goes on, uncut, for another 60 seconds. The director would carry this long-take technique to its logical end in his 1948 movie Rope. There, he used shots of 9 minutes and more. Hitchcock famously said, "Actors are cattle," or "actors should be treated as cattle." Michael Redgrave never knew if the director meant him or actors generally, but the performances of Redgrave and the rest of the cast were strong, due in part to the script, the photography, the editing, and certainly the direction. Start with Dame May Whitty as Miss Froy. Iris generously describes her as sort of middle-aged. Whitty, however, was closing on 75, and her character looked it. Early on, she seems dottery. She even mistakes, or pretends to mistake, the closeted adulterers for sexual innocence.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry. You can always tell a honeymoon couple, you know. They're so shy.
But Miss Froy's no fool. Listen closely to why she reads a knitting magazine.
There's a most intriguing acrostic in The Needlewoman. I'm going to try and unravel it before you wake up.
Forget about the pun on the word unravel. There's a mind at work here, in a woman capable of navigating her way, alone, through a complicated maze of words and world affairs.
And I am Dr. Egon Hartz of Prague.
Then we have Paul Lucas as Dr. Hartz. The novel introduces the character by noting, as omen, his black spade beard and repulsive face. The movie's more subtle. On his introduction, his wardrobe hints at a touch of evil, via suits and collars that seem faintly Transylvanian. Hartz looks ahead to those other creatures of the night, Alex Sebastian in Notorious, and Philip Van Damme in North by Northwest.
So interesting. You know, if one had time, one could trace the cause of the hallucination.
Like Claude Rains and James Mason, Paul Lucas was adept at using his voice for dramatic effect. When he purports to explain Iris's condition, he's a caring surgeon.
Advertisement or a character in a novel subconsciously remembered. No, there is no reason to be frightened.
When he has Gilbert and Iris in his grip, he's a killer. Remember, he has already announced his intention to murder Miss Froy when he tells Iris and Gilbert that, on his word, he has given them a normal dose of hydrocin.
You see, I am in this conspiracy, as you term it.
As he explains his plans,
You are a very alert young couple, but it's quite useless for you to think, as you are undoubtedly doing, of a way out of your dilemma.
he becomes a malevolent uncle telling his niece and nephew a bedtime horror story. His head tilts from side to side. He feels for his victims and apologizes to them and maybe to us.
Need I say how sorry I am having to take such a, how shall I say, melodramatic course?
Was this Hitchcock, the greatest director of screen melodramas in the world, kidding his reputation and his critics? Meanwhile, as Miss Froy and Hartz fight over the future of the world, Naughton Wayne as Caldecott and Basil Radford as Charters quietly steal the movie.
Come on.
These funny men have deep comic roots. In The Business with a Hanger, Caldecott behaves like Stan Laurel. In the headbanging slapstick, Charters behaves like Oliver Hardy. Later, seated in their Hitchcock and Cox introduce Charters and Caldecott in a shot they share, at length. Thereafter, they never stray from one another's space or reach. When one gentleman vanishes, the other searches him out. They do things for each other, and they share things with one another. Cigarettes, handkerchiefs, and a fear of women.
She doesn't understand. No. Come on. Anna!
Hitchcock even uses what he called negative acting to underline that fear of women.
Well, our legs gave out a little.
For one thing, her fiancé probably has no sense of humor. Iris does. Notice the fun she has in putting on the airs she doesn't have.
Avalanche, Boris. Avalanche.
Notice, too, her strong identity as Iris Henderson. Her scarf proclaims her singleness, and so does her handbag.
The only thing I like about him is his...
She has not sought out a man, but when she does, she expects him to be useful, like Rudolph,
Rudolph, give me a hand.
or like Gilbert, who knows how to keep her on her toes.
I'll explain it.
What exactly do you think you're doing?
Iris and Gilbert meet cute. Like a character out of screwball comedy, she minces neither words nor actions. Neither does Gilbert. But Gilbert, he of the clarinet and the walking stick, has awakened Iris's sexuality. Surely the direction's Hitchcock's, but the richness of Iris's reaction is Margaret Lockwood's. Does Iris even know she's fallen in love at first sight? What's the difference? By the end, she belongs to him and vice versa. About Michael Redgrave. Rachel Lowe, in her History of British Cinema, says that in the 1930s, Robert Donat and Michael Redgrave, quote, stood out from the many neat, stereotyped, and slightly effeminate West End actors of the previous few years. Redgrave, however, resisted film. He had a bit part in Secret Agent, and 2 years later, with no great fondness for Hitchcock or the movies, he agreed to...
I haven't the faintest recollection. You must be making a mistake.
Early on, Caldecott and Charters share his reticence. Unlike Iris, they would not have slowed down a train to find a woman or her captors. Todd Hunter and the Cricket Fanciers resemble Bogart in the opening reels of Casablanca when he says, "I stick my neck out for nobody."
Listen, everybody, there's a woman on this train, Miss Froy. Some of you must have seen her. They're hiding her somewhere. I appeal to you, all of you, to stop the train.
Speaking of the personal, Gilbert has supported Iris but sometimes doubted her. Like England, and like Iris at several points in the movie, he has been asleep, drugged as it were, until he awakens, like Bogart, to his duty.
I've got something to say. Will you all please listen? An attempt has been made to abduct this lady by force.
Notice that when he speaks, he stands more or less as Iris stood, and says almost what she says.
This train's been diverted onto a branch line.
By joining Iris in her quest, Gilbert declares not only his patriotism, but his love. When he rushes out to take control of the train, he and Iris share a farewell that acknowledges their mutual affection, as well as the bittersweet fact that, like Bogart and Bergman, they're part of something bigger than themselves. Once the shooting starts, the lovers are not the only ones affected. Caldecott speaks from experience.
Nasty jam, this.
And Charters bears the mark of nasty jams they may have shared. Casualties are inevitable aboard this train, which seems like a rolling armory. Signor Doppo brandishes a switchblade. Hartz carries a gun, or a finger that gets the job done. Though Todd Hunter will not use it, he has a gun, and Caldecott, a crack shot, tells off Todd Hunter in the movie's most topical line, "Pacifist? Won't work. Christians tried it and got thrown to the lions.
Pacifist, eh? Won't work, old boy. Early Christians tried it and got thrown to the lions. Come on, hang it.
Todd Hunter's lover takes up arms, and so do Gilbert, Caldecott, and Charters, with Charters wounded but unafraid. Miss Froy, it turns out, can run faster than speeding bullets, and the nun can leap locomotives in a single bound. So hooray for the British, and 3 cheers for the dozing censor who allowed that Bandrican officer to remind us of Gestapo and the politics of the era.
I have come to offer the most sincere apologies. An extremely serious incident has occurred. An attempt has been made to interfere with passengers on this train. Fortunately, it was brought to the notice of the authorities, and so if you will be good enough to accompany me to Moscow, I will inform the British Embassy at once.
The very first films of Alfred Hitchcock, like those of Orson Welles, were the work of a mature artist. The Lady Vanishes was nonetheless a crucial achievement. First, it showed once more how much Hitchcock could do with limited resources. Second, it showed how cleverly he could expand the possibilities of genre. Both of these facts made him attractive to Hollywood, where he longed to work. Perhaps most important, The Lady Vanishes showed more than any of his films to date how he had mastered the interweaving of romance, suspense, and humor. The Lady Vanishes is pitch perfect, especially in the droll humor we associate with Hitchcock. An example? How about Charters and Caldecott dressing for dinner in a provincial railway hotel? Or the shootout that feels so much like a Western that Charters takes up the lingo.
Hang on to this for a minute, will you? All right, I'll hold the fort.
Or Miss Froy's final lines, said as though she were inviting Gilbert to tea.
Do you mind if I talk to you for a minute?
What now?
Yes, please forgive me, but it's very important.
Or Gilbert's instructions to the cabbie.
Foreign Office.
To paraphrase Miss Froy, you can always tell a honeymoon couple they're on their way to the Foreign Office? After The Lady Vanishes, Hitchcock made one more film in London, then went to Hollywood, where he became known as the master of suspense. More than 60 years after the fact, though, The Lady Vanishes endures as his most entertaining English picture. Though it demonstrates his talent for collaboration, it also displays his vaunted touch at its most secure and at its lightest. To state the obvious, it rewards multiple viewings. Or, as they say in Bandrika, na kruska natra trapahachkrak, which means, loosely translated, will always have Hitchcock and The Lady Vanishes. This is Leonard Leff. Thanks for listening and watching.